Maya Thompson was a woman of many layers. To the people in her suburban neighborhood in Raleigh, North Carolina, she was just another face in the crowd. A 35-year-old mother of two, a woman who had spent the last 10 years quietly navigating the complexities of both American life and her heritage from Nigeria. But there was more to Maya than met the eye, much more. Stay with us to see what unfolds next. She was known for her grace, intelligence, and understated strength. In her professional life, Maya was a CIA officer, a highly trained operative in counterintelligence. Her experience ran deep, her reputation was solid, and her ability to blend in had made her one of the agency's best. But Maya wasn't just a career woman. She was a mother and a wife, with a home that was her sanctuary, a place she cherished. Maya was married to Marcus Thompson, a former Army officer turned civil rights attorney. The two had met at a gathering for military families, and their connection was instant. Marcus was a kind-hearted man, fiercely protective of Maya and their children, but with a wit that could lighten any situation. They had two children, their eldest, Jordan, a 9-year-old with a curious mind and an insatiable hunger for learning, and little Ava, their 5-year-old bundle of joy, who was already proving to be as sharp and tenacious as her mother. Maya and Marcus had built a life together that seemed almost idyllic. They lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, one that allowed them a semblance of normalcy despite Maya's high-risk job. Marcus, though deeply supportive of his wife's career, often worried about the dangers it brought into their lives. Maya's world was full of secrets, but her family had learned to adjust to the subtle nuances of her absence during long, mysterious business trips. She would always return, however, and her absence only served to strengthen the bond they shared. On the outside, Maya appeared as though she lived an ordinary life. But as she sat on her porch this warm spring evening, enjoying a rare moment of peace, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Something was off in the air. Her instincts were telling her that today would not be like any other. It was a quiet evening. The golden hue of the setting sun bathed the cul-de-sac in a tranquil glow. Maya sat on her porch, a cup of chamomile tea in hand, while Jordan and Ava played in the yard. The house was alive with the laughter of her children, the sound of sneakers on the pavement, and the occasional bark of the neighbor's dog. It was a scene that any passerby would assume was as peaceful and mundane as it seemed. Maya had just put her phone down after a brief check-in with her CIA team when her eyes caught two figures moving down her driveway. At first, she thought they were just some of the neighborhood kids playing around, but the sight of their matching blue shirts quickly erased that thought. They weren't kids. These men were too confident, too deliberate in their movements. The two men walked up to her porch, their eyes scanning the perimeter of her property before they made their way directly toward her. Maya's body tensed, and her hand instinctively moved toward her concealed sidearm beneath the cushion on the porch chair. She didn't expect trouble, at least not this kind, but she always prepared for it. This was her life, after all. The taller of the two men with graying hair and a stern face spoke first. "Miss Thompson?" he asked, his voice firm, but not unfriendly. Maya stood slowly, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. Then the second man, slightly shorter, dark-skinned with a thin mustache. Neither man looked particularly threatening on the surface, but the way they carried themselves made her instincts buzz. "Yes, that's me," Maya replied, her voice even, betraying no sign of the growing unease inside her. "Can I help you?" "We're from the Homeowners Association," the tall man said, flashing a badge that looked a little too shiny and new. "We've received complaints about noise violations at your residence. We're going to need you to come with us for a discussion about this." Maya raised an eyebrow. Noise violations? It was an odd thing for an HOA to get worked up about, especially when she hadn't thrown a party in weeks. The men's body language felt wrong, too formal, too calculated. "Excuse me." Maya's tone was now sharper. "Noise violations? I haven't been issued any formal complaints or warnings." The second man stepped forward, his eyes hardening. "We don't need to explain ourselves. We have our orders. Please step down from the porch." Maya's hand subtly shifted towards her phone. She wasn't about to make a scene, not yet, but her mind was racing, piecing together the pieces. The last time she'd heard of officials being too quick to take action without proper procedure had been a part of a larger scheme. It wasn't a noise complaint. It wasn't the HOA. It was a setup. "I'm not going anywhere," Maya said, her voice calm but firm. "If you're real HOA representatives, you'll have some paperwork and legal documentation. Let me see it." The tall man hesitated. The look in his eyes flickered. His confidence wavered. But he quickly recovered. "This is your last warning, Ms. Thompson." He reached for her arm, but Maya's reflexes kicked in. In one swift motion, she sidestepped, grabbing his wrist and twisting it behind his back with the precision of someone who had done this 100 times before. The second man lunged at her, but she was ready, ducking under his arm and moving to the side in a fluid motion that left him stumbling. "You need to leave," Maya said, her voice low, her expression a mixture of calm and cold determination. It was then that the men's facade completely cracked. The tall man's phone buzzed in his pocket. He checked it, his expression changing from one of forced authority to panic. The other man was visibly sweating, his hands shaking slightly as he looked from Maya to the road. And then Maya's instincts hit a peak. She wasn't just dealing with amateurs. These men weren't who they claimed to be. "Don't do something you'll regret," Maya warned, keeping her voice steady. "This is bigger than you think." But they didn't listen. The taller man reached for something at his waist, a concealed weapon. But before he could draw it, a black SUV pulled up sharply at the end of the driveway. Maya didn't flinch. She knew the vehicle, the driver, and the people inside. Backup had arrived. As the SUV doors opened, two men in sharp suits stepped out, their demeanor one of unquestionable authority. The taller man looked toward them, his face paling as the figures approached. Maya knew what this meant. The game had just changed, and these imposters were about to find out just how far over their heads they had gone. The black SUV's tires screeched against the pavement as it made a sharp stop at the end of Maya's driveway, the gravel scattering with the abrupt halt. Maya stood firm on her porch, her posture exuding an unmistakable calm that contrasted sharply with the chaos unfolding before her. The men who stepped out of the vehicle moved with purpose. Their suits were tailored perfectly, dark and impeccable, adding to their authoritative aura. One was taller than the other, but both walked with an air of confidence that made it clear they were more than just your average suit-wearing bureaucrats. Maya's eyes flicked briefly to the two men still standing at the base of her porch, their faces full of confusion and fear. They had underestimated her, and now, with the arrival of these two new figures, they were realizing just how deep they had dug themselves into trouble. The taller man, his features sharp and calculating, took a step forward. His eyes didn't wander. They locked onto Maya. There was no sign of hesitation in his stride. "We've been looking for you," he said with an icy calm, his voice steady but laced with authority. "Maya Thompson." Maya didn't flinch. She didn't need to. This was familiar territory to her. They had no idea what they had just walked into. She nodded, her gaze unwavering. "And who are you?" Her voice held a quiet command, the kind that made the air around them seem still. "You've been looking for me? I don't think this is how you should be handling things." The man's lips curled slightly into a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say we're here to clean up a mess." His gaze flicked to the two imposter HOA men, who were now visibly shaking, eyes wide and panicked. "You've made quite a mistake, gentlemen," he added, his voice turning cold as he addressed them. "You should have known who you were dealing with." The smaller of the two HOA impersonators took a step back, his hand brushing against his waist as if he were reaching for something, perhaps a weapon. But before he could make another move, the shorter man from the SUV spoke again, his voice low but edged with venom. "You've put yourself in a very dangerous position, trying to drag someone like Maya Thompson off her own property?" The man shook his head in disbelief, clearly unimpressed with their ineptitude. "You don't know who you're dealing with." At the mention of Maya's full name, the two men who had tried to accost her suddenly seemed smaller. The tall man visibly swallowed, realizing his mistake in attempting to push a woman with such a history into a corner. Maya watched the interaction unfold with a sharp, controlled breath. It was surreal to her, but she knew that this was the type of conflict that her world was built on. The world of secrecy, of protecting one's identity, of never being fully recognized for who you were until it was far too late. Maya slowly turned her back to the two men still standing, and for a moment, she allowed herself to focus on the unfamiliar faces standing at the edge of her driveway. She didn't need to say anything more. Her body language alone was enough to convey that she wasn't intimidated, not even a little. The two men from the SUV stood there silently. One of them, tall and with a slight grin, leaned casually against the car. He didn't look at the two HOA impersonators. His gaze remained solely on Maya, as if he were gauging her next move, studying her. "I didn't think it would come to this," Maya said coolly, her voice now breaking the silence. "But you've been harassing my family for months now. What do you want from me?" The taller man shifted, his grin growing just a little wider. "You're CIA, Maya. You know the game. I'd have thought you'd figure it out sooner." His gaze flicked to the two men who had tried to drag her off her porch. "These two gentlemen, as you've already guessed, aren't actually from your local HOA. They were just hired muscle." Maya's eyes narrowed slightly. She had been so careful. She'd made sure her family was protected. But these men had crossed a line, and they hadn't known that she had made the decision to turn her life into a carefully calculated chessboard. Her mind flashed back to the phone call from earlier in the day, the one where she had suspected something was off about the whole situation. She had already called her backup, knowing she couldn't face this alone. "So you're saying," Maya continued, her tone steady but carrying an unmistakable edge, "that these men are not only trespassing on my property, but are also working for someone else?" The man who had spoken first took a step closer, but still kept his distance. His eyes focused on Maya as if testing her resolve. "Exactly," he said. "They've been sent by someone who's interested in something you have. Or more accurately, something you know." Maya clenched her fist but remained composed. The pieces were starting to fall into place. The things she'd been investigating, the people she'd been tracking, had been closing in. And now they were here, on her doorstep, trying to intimidate her into submission. "And just who might that be?" Maya asked, a challenge in her voice. The tall man smiled again, but this time it was a smile that held no warmth. "We don't have the luxury of time. You don't know who's really pulling the strings here. But we can assure you, they don't care about your little life in this suburban neighborhood. They want you in play. And if you don't cooperate—" He let the threat hang in the air. The other man in the suit, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was even, measured, but unmistakably dangerous. "The bigger question, Maya, is how long do you think you can keep this up? You've lived in the shadows long enough. It's time to come out." Maya was no stranger to threats. She'd seen the worst in people: desperation, fear, anger, even rage. But there was one thing she'd learned over the years, especially after all the covert operations she'd conducted for the CIA: the power of calm. She glanced over her shoulder, locking eyes with Marcus, who had stepped out onto the porch behind her, his presence as solid as ever. He didn't say anything, but his look spoke volumes. He trusted her. He knew what she was capable of. Maya stood taller now. "I don't think you understand who you're dealing with. If you think for 1 second that you can intimidate me into giving up my family, my life, you've got another thing coming." The men's expressions faltered for just a split second. She moved toward the SUV, her voice steady but authoritative. "You're right. It's time for me to come out, but not the way you think." Maya reached into her jacket and pulled out a small, nondescript phone. She held it up for the two men to see, her finger hovering over the button. The tall man's expression shifted again. This time, it was unmistakable fear. "You don't realize this," Maya continued, "but this isn't a situation where I'm in danger. You are. This phone is sending a signal to several of my very close associates, and trust me, if you don't leave my property right now, we're all going to have a very different conversation." The two men didn't move for a long moment, but they were clearly rattled. Finally, the shorter man nodded to the taller one. "Fine," the taller man said curtly. "We're leaving." As the imposters turned and retreated, Maya's phone buzzed with an encrypted message. Her eyes narrowed as she read it. "They'll be back, and next time, they won't be alone." The suspense was thick in the air. Maya knew this was far from over. Maya stood on the porch, her pulse still steady, her composure unshaken. The men in suits had left, disappearing in their sleek black SUV. But the air felt thicker now, as though the whole world had shifted just a fraction, a pivot that couldn't be undone. She didn't move immediately. Her hand hovered over the phone in her pocket, her finger gently tapping it as if sensing that the moment was far from over. She could hear the faint sound of Marcus moving behind her, his careful footsteps the only sound in the stillness. "Maya?" he called softly, the concern in his voice impossible to mask. Maya didn't answer right away. Instead, she slowly turned to face him. Marcus stood at the edge of the porch, his expression a mixture of concern and wariness. His arms were crossed over his chest, the familiar tightness in his posture, telling Maya that the protective instinct in him was in full swing. "What just happened?" Marcus asked, stepping closer, his voice a low murmur that carried the weight of a man who was used to understanding things, who was used to having control. Maya exhaled slowly, her eyes locked on his. "They came for me, Marcus. But they didn't come alone." Marcus's brow furrowed, his lips thinning as he processed her words. "Who were they?" "Imposters," Maya said, her voice calm but tinged with frustration. "They weren't from the HOA. They were hired muscle, probably to intimidate me into backing off from whatever investigation I've been working on." She paused, her eyes scanning the quiet neighborhood, ensuring they weren't being watched. "But I think this goes deeper than just a couple of hired goons. Someone wants me to stop what I'm doing, and that someone has the resources to make this personal." "Are you in danger?" Marcus asked, his voice soft but urgent. She hesitated. The words were heavy, and for a moment she felt the weight of her secret life bearing down on her. She didn't want Marcus involved in this. He had his own battles to fight, his own mission to push forward as a civil rights attorney. She'd always shielded him from the worst of her work, never wanting to drag him into the messiness of her world. But now she wasn't sure if she had a choice. "Possibly," she finally said, "but I can handle it." Marcus stepped closer, his presence a quiet storm. "You don't have to do this alone, Maya. We're a team. We always have been." Maya felt the sharp pang of guilt hit her chest. She knew Marcus meant well, but she couldn't help but wonder if he fully understood the depths of what she was dealing with. The CIA wasn't just some job. It was a world of shadows of dangerous people who had no qualms about using your family as leverage. It was a game where you couldn't always afford to play by the rules. "Maya," Marcus began again, his voice quieter now, "we're in this together, no matter what. But if you're worried about our safety or our kids, you need to tell me." Maya's eyes softened as she placed her hand gently on his. It was a rare moment of vulnerability, a crack in the armor she'd spent years building. She wasn't used to asking for help, but right now she needs his strength. "I'll be careful," Maya said, her voice firming, "but I need you to trust me. I have a plan. I always do." Marcus didn't respond right away, but he gave a small nod, his eyes filled with the kind of unwavering trust that only years of marriage and shared experiences could foster. The air between them was still thick, but for the first time in a long time, Maya allowed herself to breathe a little easier. She wasn't alone in this. The night crept in quickly, the sky turning darker as the first stars appeared, their cold light shimmering across the quiet suburban streets. Inside their home, Maya and Marcus sat at the kitchen table, the remnants of dinner still scattered across the counter. Jordan and Ava had gone to bed, their laughter and lightheartedness now replaced by the gentle hum of the house. The silence that followed was filled with the weight of unspoken words. Maya's thoughts were a whirlwind of calculations, memories, and a single insistent question: who was behind this? She had thought about it over and over since the men in suits had left. There were too many red flags for this to be a random act of intimidation. The HOA, a neighborhood organization designed to maintain the aesthetics of suburban life, had no business sending men like that to her doorstep. This was something much more calculated. Someone had learned who she was, what she had done, and they had chosen to come after her in a way that would rattle her entire world. Her phone buzzed again, breaking her thoughts. It was a message from her contact at the CIA. "They're not done. There's a bigger player involved. We need you back in the game, Maya. It's time to pull the trigger." Maya stared at the screen for a long moment. There it was, proof that she wasn't imagining things. This wasn't just about a noise complaint. This was about something far bigger, a deepening web of conspiracy and power that reached far beyond the confines of her quiet neighborhood. Marcus, she said softly, looking up from her phone, her eyes meeting him. He turned to her, sensing the shift in her demeanor. What is it? They're coming for me, she said, her voice steady but filled with the weight of truth. And I think I know who's behind it. Marcus's brow furrowed. Who? Maya paused. She could feel the tension building between them, the gravity of her words settling over their conversation. I'm going to have to go back into the field, Marcus. I can't explain everything right now, but you need to know this. It's going to get dangerous, and I need you to trust me when I say, don't come looking for me. It's too risky. Marcus's jaw clenched. I'm not just going to sit here and let you go alone. You know that, right? Maya's heart ached at his words. She loved him for that, for his willingness to stand by her side no matter the cost. But this was bigger than the two of them. This was a matter of national security, of lives hanging in the balance. I don't have a choice, Marcus, Maya replied, her voice low. This is what I do. It's who I am. Maya rose from the table, her mind already working, planning, strategizing. She reached for her jacket, the cool fabric of familiar touch as she buttoned it up. I've already sent word to my team. They'll be waiting for me. Marcus stood too, moving toward her. Maya, please be careful. I know you're good at what you do, but this... He hesitated, looking her in the eyes. I don't know who you're up against, but I don't want to lose you. Maya took a step toward him and pulled him into a hug. It was brief, but it conveyed everything she couldn't say. I'll be back, I promise. But right now, you need to stay here. Keep our kids safe. Marcus nodded, his grip on her tightening for just a moment before he let go. I'll be here when you get back. Just promise me you won't be reckless. Maya smiled softly. I'll never be reckless. As she turned to leave, the weight of the situation settled fully into her bones. She was about to face a force that was far more dangerous than anything she had ever encountered before. But she wasn't afraid. Maya Thompson was ready to fight, and she wasn't going down without a fight. As Maya stepped out into the night, the message from her CIA contact burned in her mind. We need you back in the game. But just as she reached her car, she froze. A shadow moved in the distance. Someone was watching, and this time Maya wasn't sure if they were friend or foe. Maya paused, her fingers tightening around the door handle of her car. A shadow shifted again from the corner of her eye, just outside her driveway, moving with deliberate slowness. The familiar sense of being watched, something that had long been second nature to her in her line of work, flared to life. Her heart rate didn't spike. Instead, it remained measured. Calm. She had been here before, many times. But this time, something felt different. She wasn't just dealing with faceless enemies anymore. She was dealing with someone who knew how to manipulate the game, someone who had resources, who understood the stakes, and who was willing to use anything, anyone to force her hand. Show yourself, Maya called out, her voice steady and low. The figure stopped. A man tall with broad shoulders stepped from the shadows. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, his expression hidden under the brim of his dark baseball cap. The tension in the air was thick, as though the night itself had been holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. Maya didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that you couldn't let fear control your moves, not in a world where one wrong step could be the last. She reached inside her jacket, fingers brushing against the cold metal of her weapon. But she knew she wasn't going to need it this time. She had other ways of dealing with this. Her mind was her sharpest weapon, and it was time to use it. The man finally spoke, his voice deep and heavy. You've been a thorn in their side for too long, Maya. You should have known this would come. Maya's brow furrowed. The realization hit her like a wave. He wasn't here to intimidate her. He wasn't a simple pawn. He was part of the larger puzzle. Someone sent to deal with her once and for all. Who are you working for? She asked, her voice cold and controlled. And what do you want from me? He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was calculated. You've seen the bigger picture now, haven't you? The people who run the world don't appreciate when someone like you starts asking questions. You're a liability. Maya didn't respond immediately. but her hand tightened on the edge of the car door. Her instincts were firing at full capacity now. This wasn't just a random encounter. This was the final phase of a game that had been set in motion long before she even realized it. "I don't know who you think you are," Maya finally said, her tone sharp, "but I'm not just going to roll over for you or your bosses. You came here expecting me to fold, but you're wrong." The man's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer, his body tense and coiled like a snake ready to strike. "It's too late for that, Maya. It's already decided." But Maya wasn't listening. Instead, she pressed a button on her phone, sending a final signal to her backup. She knew they were already in position, waiting for her to make the call. She had one last card to play. Suddenly, the sound of heavy boots on gravel echoed in the night air, and the man's confident stance faltered for a fraction of a second. A black SUV rounded the corner, screeching to a halt, followed by two more vehicles. Maya's team had arrived, and this time they were prepared. The man's expression turned from confidence to shock, his eyes widening as he realized what had just happened. His body tensed, ready to fight, but there was no escape. Maya's team was moving swiftly, efficiently, CIA operatives who had been tracking the same players from different angles. They didn't need to say anything. They moved in synchrony, positioning themselves strategically around the man and blocking his retreat. "Game over," Maya said, her voice steady as she watched her team take control of the situation. "It's time for you to face the consequences." The man didn't fight back, knowing that resistance would be futile. The final pieces had fallen into place, and this was the moment of reckoning. As the operation wrapped up and the threat was neutralized, Maya stood at the edge of her driveway, watching as the last of the imposters were taken into custody. The night air was cooler now, but there was a weight in the silence. It wasn't just the peace that followed a successful mission. It was something deeper. Maya had won this battle, but it had come at a cost. The people who had orchestrated this entire scheme were still out there, somewhere, and they hadn't forgotten about her. They would come again, maybe in different forms, maybe with different tactics. But Maya was ready. She turned to her team, nodding to each of them as they moved out. Her eyes met Marcus's, who had stood back, watching the events unfold from the shadows. His expression was a mixture of relief and concern. But he didn't speak. He didn't need to. Maya could see the questions in his eyes, the same ones he had been holding back ever since the first shadow had crossed her driveway. He understood now in a way he hadn't before. This wasn't just her job. This was her life. Maya didn't offer any answers. Not yet, anyway. But she would, in time. For now, the most important thing was that her family was safe. As Maya stepped back inside her home, closing the door behind her, she felt the weight of the day settle into her bones. But there was a sense of fulfillment, too, a sense of knowing that justice had been served, even if only for a moment. The real lesson in this wasn't about defeating her enemies or overcoming the obstacles they put in her path. The true lesson was about standing firm in the face of adversity. It was about not being defined by the challenges life throws at you, but by how you choose to respond to them. Maya Thompson had never been a woman to back down. She had faced the toughest of situations, had walked through fire more times than she could count, and every time she came out the other side stronger. It doesn't matter who or what tries to knock you down. What matters is how you stand back up. Maya didn't fight because she was fearless. She fought because she knew what was at stake, her family, her integrity, and her values. And in the end, that was all she needed. If you've been captivated by Maya's courage, her resilience, and her unshakable commitment to justice, hit that subscribe button and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Talk about it in the comments section. Don't miss out on more compelling stories that will inspire you, thrill you, and leave you wanting more.